Okay, so we'll get started officially. So welcome to this ACUR at ANU student presentation session. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the first Australians whose traditional lands we meet, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Today I'm on Dharawal Nation land, and I encourage everyone to think about the land that they're on. So my name is Molly Turnbull, and I'll be chairing today's session. Our first presenter for today is Moeko, and so please start when you're ready.
Great, okay. Well, hello everyone. My name is Moeko Reilly, and the name of my research is Japanese Heritage Language Learners, Considering Family Language Policy and Home Literacy Practices. And I would also like to acknowledge the Jagera and Turrbal people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I am presenting from today. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so let's get right into it. So heritage language learners is a term that is continuously debated because it describes a group of people who have diverse learning needs, and they also come from varied cultural and historical backgrounds. So for my research, I decided to use this definition by Valdez, which describes someone who is raised in a home where a non-English language is spoken. And they speak that heritage language and also English to some degree of bilingual proficiency. I also used the categorization by Kondo-Brown, and this categorization is important because it divides learners into subgroups based on their connection to their heritage. So the particular group I decided to look at was the Japanese Heritage Language Parent Group, and they have at least one Japanese parent and are also both actively and proficiently using Japanese at home. Now, family language policy is a combination of language policy and child language acquisition, and it describes explicit and overt planning in relation to language use within the home and also among family members. It acts as a base for child language development, and it also considers parent ideologies and beliefs which are reflected from wider societal attitudes about parenting and also language learning in general. And when considering the Japanese context, Oriyama found that parent attitudes depend on community membership, and the role of community was significant and meaningful to child language development. Now, not only are these beliefs important, but also it's important to consider what kind of practices are being undertaken. So most recent literature will refer to the home literacy model by Seneschal and Lefebvre. And this study was significant, or these studies, sorry, were significant because they divided these literacy practices into formal and informal activities. However, this also raised the question of, do children really need structured literacy experiences at home, or can they develop formal skills in formal education? I also considered the expansions of the model, and these found that parents tended to adapt their teaching to match their child. In Kreinen and colleagues' refined version of the model, they looked at a didactic approach which further broke down these formal and informal activities into code-related and meaning-related skills. And again, when considering the Japanese context, Inoue and colleagues found that maternal involvement was crucial, and the mother's expectations of education really impacted the child's language development. So with that all in mind, my two research questions were as follows. The first is, what is the relationship between family language policy and home literacy practices when considering Japanese heritage language learners in Brisbane, Australia? And the second was, which home literacy practices are commonly employed by mothers with different Japanese language beliefs to support heritage language maintenance and development? So I decided to look at the mothers. So I looked at Japanese females, and their mother tongue needed to be Japanese as well. Their children were aged between 6 and 8 years old, and they needed to be enrolled in a local supplementary or community school at the time of data collection. Using previous literature, I created an online questionnaire, and this was used to gather information like general information, Japanese language use, including the child's writing, vocabulary, and reading habits, and also the mother's thoughts on Japanese language. The data was analysed by dividing participants into 3 belief groups. So that was low belief, medium belief, and also high belief. And this was done through using their responses taken in the final section about their thoughts on language. So I've divided the results by research question, and the first research question found that when considering mothers' beliefs with frequency of home literacy practices, low belief participants reported low frequency. However, there was an inconsistency with medium and high belief participants. So high belief participants did not necessarily report high frequency, and in fact, in some instances, medium belief participants had the highest reported frequency. So then, where do these inconsistencies come from? Researchers discussed that family language policy is incredibly complex and varied, and because of that, we need to consider the differences that are in context of individuals and also families. As I previously mentioned, Inoue found the mother's role to be crucial. However, Hammer and colleagues did not find there to be a significant relationship between mother and child development. And we also see that Burgess found that the home environment and child literacy abilities were directly related, but Evans found that there was little significance between these two. So as we can see, there continues to be some ongoing debates about each of these aspects. Some other findings that are related to the first research question was the importance of culture. Kang and Oniyama both found that in certain immigrant groups, the prioritization of fostering culture was actually more important than enforcing strict language instruction. And we can see this in my findings as well, where you can see in the first statement about language and culture, quite a high number of participants strongly agreed to this. Whereas in the second statement, which is focusing on language and literacy, it's only just over half of the participants who strongly agreed. Some other findings that were not the focus of the study was that there was a relationship between demographical data and language use. I also considered perhaps that quality or variety of practices was more important than frequency. And the findings for the second research question will look at this in a little bit more detail. So the second research question considered the most commonly employed practices, and the activities were divided into writing, vocabulary, and also reading. And as we can see here, the writing activities were undertaken the most. However, correcting pronunciation actually had the highest weekly frequency responses. It is, however, important to note that reading was the only activity in which participants could report that their child didn't undertake any practices. And as such, we can notice the numbers in reading are a little bit lower than the other sections. So to summarize these findings, there was no considerable relationship found between family language policy and home literacy practices. However, there was a relationship found between demographical data and language use. This would need to be further researched because my research wasn't able to look at this thoroughly enough. We can also see that perhaps quality over frequency is more important. And this is indexed by the wide variety of practices that were undertaken by the participants. And out of these practices, the most common was a code-related teaching activity, as per previous literature. So, there were quite a few limitations to my study, including with participants, there was a small number of them, and also an uneven number, which unfortunately favored a particular age group. And when considering the design and analysis, factors such as better triangulation of data and refined measure of mothers' beliefs, as well as streamlining of questions, could have been done to make the results more accurate. Furthermore, I had planned to do a follow-up interview, but due to time constraints, this was unable to happen. And finally, there was a can-do test done for the mother's perception of the child's proficiency, but this was not used nor analysed in the final report. And lastly, some suggestions for future research. I believe it would be significant to undertake an interview and gather more extensive analysis or data, of the family, including the father's roles and the father's language proficiency, as well as conscious language choices by the individual and also the family on a whole. There could be more focus on language use and demographical data, which was found to have some kind of relationship. And there could also be a revision of activities so that they are more relevant. This could be done either in a pre-questionnaire interview or perhaps even a focus group. And finally, there could be observations or school visits so that we can better understand children's relationship with practices. And at this point, there could also be a proficiency test, which should be administered directly to the child. So that's it for me, and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for that. I love how you introduced the debate and all the little pieces of the puzzle. So if anyone who's listening, please put your questions in the chat and I'll read them aloud for you. You can put them in Q&A as well. I'll check that, but I prefer chat. But we'll first go to the judges if they have any questions.
Hi, Molly. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. It was really interesting. I was just wondering, like in your assessment, if you have looked at for the hours that the kids were exposed to Japanese language, and also if and within the family structure, did they have you look if they have siblings, if they were interacting in the language as well, because that could be influentiating the learning amount. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. So with regards to the first part of it, the hours, unfortunately, I only focused on like the number of times practices were done. So perhaps like once a week, twice a week. With reading, however, I did look at like time spent, but overall across the board, there was not any like significant differences between the groups. So I didn't really include these in the final report. But with the family structure, that is also a very good point. I did look at language that was used between perhaps, for example, the child and the mother, the child and the father, the child and the siblings, and also the overall family. And there was some relationship between the language use and also the frequency of literacy practices. But again, due to the small sample size, my supervisor and I determined that perhaps we couldn't generalize the findings and maybe there needed to be like an extended research on it to really investigate that in a little more detail.
Okay, thank you.
Great. We probably have time for another question. So Deborah, one of our judges.
Thank you. Firstly, congratulations. That was, very well done indeed, and very well organised. I had one thing to just note, and one sort of question. You were talking at one point about beliefs and, high beliefs and low beliefs. I'd kind of lost track of exactly what belief encompassed. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you could just repeat what when you're sort of talking about high and low, what you particularly would be referring to. And the second thing, I thought you made really good, your other findings were, I think, very interesting, and I really do hope you get to follow up on some of them. And when you talked about frequency and you mentioned correcting pronunciation as being something very frequent, I wondered if, you could perhaps, even if it's a, pardon me, a kind of a guess, but make some links between quality and frequency. For example, maybe correcting pronunciation is also not considered a really high quality, if you like, quality thing to do in terms of even in first language, correcting children's pronunciation isn't that valuable in some ways. But so were there other things that were done perhaps more frequently, but that seemed to be more effective? So I think you could also pull apart that aspect. But overall, not just overall, I think you've done a really good job, really nice research and well explained. But I wouldn't mind hearing more about that, the idea of belief as you used it as if it was very familiar to you.
Sure, yes. So that's a really good question. And I had a lot of discussions with my supervisor about our word choice. We thought, beliefs, thoughts, there are so many words we could use, but we had to be careful because the idea was that it was just how the mother felt about Japanese language and their child learning language. And of course, it's always like a bit of a touchy area, perhaps for some people. And the original survey was actually done in Japanese. So it was kind of more like a translation, I suppose, of the term. But basically the idea was that a high belief participant was more likely to think, for example, they would be for more language learning and their child being perhaps more fluent or engaging more with language, whereas a low belief participant perhaps would not really prioritize Japanese language learning, is the rough idea.
Thank you very much. Really nicely responded to. Thanks.
Thank you so much for asking the question.
Awesome. So I'm really sorry if anyone in the chat had questions, but we'll have to move on to the next person just for the sake of time. But if you had any questions, you can always email or pop it in the chat for later. So we'll move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker today is Keira. So when you're ready, hopefully the permissions are all good, but let me know.
Yeah, it's looking good. Can you see that?
Yeah, that looks great. Sounds good too. So whenever you're ready.
Perfect. So hi, I'm Keira. Today I'm going to be presenting on documenting the Kuffar language, specifically on the number and gender of nouns. So this is the first description of the noun system in this language, and there hasn't really been any work describing the language at all before this. So first I'm just going to go over a bit of background about the Kuffar language and the data collection process. Then I will explain the result of my research. So I'll describe the number inflections that occur in Kuffar and the gender system. And then finally, I'll go over some implications for this research and sort of the future trajectory of the Kuffar project. Okay, so Kuffar is a Kajugli-Krongo language from the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. The larger affiliations of the group are unknown. This is mainly due to the group being largely undocumented. The only substantive work done on a language of this group previously is Raíz de Congo Swah, which was done in 1983 on the Krongo language. So you can just see here on the map, it points to where the Kuffar tribe is located here in the mountains. So Kuffar is a vulnerable language, according to the criteria outlined in the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger. And the only work that has been done, particularly on the Kuffar language before, was Hall and Hall 2004, which proposed an orthography for writing Kuffar. And so just also here, I have a photo of the Kuffar village supplied by Harun, who is the language consultant I worked with in this research. So now if we just move on to the, sorry, let me just get my little. So the data used in this research was collected during a linguistics field methods course in the first semester of this year. So we worked with a diasporic Kuffar speaker located in rural Victoria. We did a combination of in-person and Zoom sessions where the main method was through linguistic elicitation. So asking things like, what is the word for ear? What is the word for ears? And getting those things in Kuffar, and this slowly developed to more complex structures and sentences as we became more familiar with the language. So now if we move on to the results, okay. Start with the number inflections in Kuffar. So Kuffar displays quite a rare system of number inflections, so it has singular, plural, and partitive inflections. So I determined this by studying the language at the level of morphology, so by breaking words into their smallest parts and looking at what those parts are. So I'll start with the plural inflections because that is most familiar to English speakers. So here I have a couple of examples. So there's actually about 10 plural inflections that nouns can take in Kuffar, but the two that I have here probably they go in the vast majority of nouns. The others are quite rare. So if we look at the first example, we have the word room, which in its base form embodies a singular meaning. So we have la, and to make it plural, we add this prefix na, and we get nalla. So this prefix used quite widely. It can occur on pretty much any type of noun and sort of in any semantic domain. This is in comparison to if we look at the second example, I have friend here. So in its base form is tola, and then we get the plural katola with this prefix ka. And so this ka prefix only occurs on nouns that refer to people, which is why here we have it appearing on the noun friend. So now if we look at singular inflections, which is something that isn't in English. So here if we look at the first example, again, there's a couple other singular inflections, but these two are by far the most common. So the base form of the noun hair, we have uo, and that means this is hair on the head in the plural. And to make it singular, we add an inflection. We add this prefix and we get ndal uo. If we look at the second example, which is the word heart, so we have nogo, which is the base form and is a plural noun. And then to make it singular, we add this prefix te. And so this te prefix is also very semantically conditioned. So all internal organs in Kuffar embody a plural meaning in their base form and take this inflection te. And now finally, if we look at the partitive inflections, this is something, again, which isn't in English and is quite rare. So these partitive inflections occur on mass nouns. So we do have mass nouns in English, so words like rice, where you can't really say one rice, two rice, you say 1 grain of rice, because it's not countable. And so it's the same idea with these mass nouns. So if we look at the first noun, fire, in its mass form we have ishi, and then we add the partitive inflection, we get ndal ishi, which is a piece of fire, so it actually translates to flame. And then the second example with water, so beji is water, and in the partitive we get tembeji. So you notice that these partitive inflections very closely resemble the singular ones, but they are different because they behave a little different syntactically. So if you have a look at this example in the bottom right corner, this sentence, tembeji Keira, is 2 drops of water. And so if this tem inflection here, which I've got glossed as a partitive, if it was a singular, we'd see the noun reverting back to beji when we added a number greater than 1. So you would just get beji Keira here if it was a singulative, but because we're still getting tembeji, we know that this is a different type of inflection. Cool. And now if I go on to the gender system, so Kuffar has 4 genders: masculine, feminine, neuter, and mass. And so to determine that the language has genders, I looked for systematic covariance of agreement forms. And so the agreement forms in Kuffar are the verbal subject agreement prefixes. And it's the combination of what prefix a noun triggers in its singular and its plural form that shows what gender it is. So if we look at the first example, which is the masculine gender, we have the noun mide, which is man, and we get mide alu. And so if you look here at this prefix, we get the a, which is indicating a masculine singular subject. And then if we take a plural masculine noun, which I've got the example here, nari, which is rivers, we get nari kalu, which this ka is indicating a masculine plural subject. And now if we go on to feminine, so we have a feminine noun, which is linya, which is woman. And here we get linya malu. So you notice that the ma here contrasts with the a that we saw for the masculine. And so the ma is indicating a feminine singular subject. So that's the woman is lovely. And then if we have a plural one, we get iya kalu, which is the women are lovely. And here the ka, it's the same as the masculine one here, but in this case, it's indicating a feminine plural subject. If we go on to the next one, which is neuter, so we have the noun nezo, which is ear. So we get nezo nalu, the ear is healthy. This is the same verb, but it makes a little bit more sense to translate it as healthy here, which is why it's healthy rather than lovely. And we get the na, which is contrasting with the a and the ma that we saw before and indicating this is a different gender. So it's the neuter singular subject. And then if we go to the plural, we get ezene kalu, which again, the ka is the same, but in this case is indicating a neuter plural subject. And finally, if we look at the mass gender, So these are the mass nouns, which I mentioned before, fit into this gender. And so if we look at when a mass noun takes a partitive inflection, so kuri, which is food, is a mass noun here. So we tunguri nallu. This is a mass noun in the partitive subject. So you'll notice here that it is the same as the neuter, but the reason that we know that this is a different gender and the mass nouns aren't neuter nouns is because if you look at the mass form down here, we're getting kuri allu, where the a contrasts with the ka we've seen before. And because it's the combination here that is indicating the gender rather than just one inflection in the partitive or one inflection in the mass, is why it's important to consider these inflections in pairs, even though for the first three genders, the plural does take the same inflection. Cool. And now if we just move on to the sort of future trajectory of study on kufu. So this research is particularly useful for determining the larger affiliations of the Kuduli-Krongo family, which is an ongoing project that there's lots of people trying to work out. So for example, if we have a look here, this is an example of singulative marking in Bale, which is a Semitic language spoken in Ethiopia. And so this noun, morning star, in its base form is a plural, which is munyono. And then it takes a singular inflection and you get munyonote. And so you hear that este here very closely resembles what we saw before in Kufu. And so we can use data like this to say, like, maybe this language is related to Kufu, and we can start trying to draw conclusions about the larger affiliations of the Kuduli-Krongo language by comparing the Kufu data with the data of languages in surrounding areas. As well as this, there is an ongoing project to develop a Kufu dictionary, a short grammar describing the language, and a collection of annotated texts. So here is a draft entry from that I wrote for the Kufu dictionary. And so as you can see in the dictionary, it includes the information of, so it includes the plural form of the noun, as well as the gender. And this is pretty important to make the resources accurate and useful. You know, if you're going to look up a word, you're going to want to know its gender so that you can use the appropriate verbal agreement prefix.
Sorry, Keira, just if we could wrap up this one, sorry, just for time.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, well, that was all I had anyway. I just had some acknowledgements and references here. Sorry.
Perfect. No, don't say sorry. I just want to remind you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I loved how you explained the methods. It was really helpful for me because this is not my area. I'll open up to the judges, but again, if anyone wants to pop anything in the chat, I'll be there reading it. We have time for a little quick question if people still wanted.
Well, I just wanted to say I think you did a really wonderful job, and in particular, I thought the way you described the relationship between having to look at the different genders together and as Molly said, basically explaining the method, I thought you just did a really good job. So well done. It was really interesting, and also lovely to see how it's going to be used in dictionaries and to compare to other languages and so on. So yeah, really well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Just for the sake of time. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
We can do a quick one.
No. Just for I found very interesting, and I was just wondering, like, in future plans, would be involved as well to work with someone from the community, in Australia, to try to spread the word.
Yeah. With this one, it's a little bit hard. We would like to work with more people, more Kufu speakers, particularly, but there's only one located in Australia, and the rest who are in the Nuba Mountains in Sudan are it's very hard to contact them. There's no reliable access to the internet or technology. So at the moment, it's quite limited with just the one speaker that we're working with.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Keira. I'm sure if there's any other questions, just pop them in the chat or email her. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one just for time. So up next is Brittany. If you're ready, hopefully you can share screen.
Can everyone see that?
It says started screen sharing. It's just come up. Awesome. Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, so ready to start them?
If you just want to pop it on like slideshow mode or something as well. But yeah, it looks good. Good to go.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Brittney Smith, and I completed my psychology honours degree last year at the University of Adelaide. My thesis is on eco-anxiety, a discourse analysis of media representations of the school strike for climate movement. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that today I'm speaking on Kaurna land, and I pay my respect to both past and future Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'd also like to thank my supervisor, Professor Martha Augustinos, for her contribution to this thesis. And all my references are listed at the end of this presentation, but please refer to my thesis for a comprehensive list of all the sources I've used. So today I'm just going to be running through my thesis and the different components and then finishing up with my conclusion. So the purpose of my study was to employ a critical discourse analysis to discover how the school strike for climate movement was represented by the Australian newspaper press and in respect to both eco-anxiety and climate change. So there hasn't been any discursive research in Australia looking at this issue through the focus of eco-anxiety as an explanation for the unprecedented extent of the protests. So I looked at two research questions of how they were represented by the media and how climate change was socially constructed as well. And I hypothesised that progressive sources, those from Nine Entertainment Corporation, would be more positive and sympathetic to the school strikers and the climate change crisis, whilst the conservative sources, those from News Corp and West, from Nine and gosh, now I've forgotten the name, Seven West Media, my apologies, that they would frame them more negatively. So Greta Thunberg in 2018 started to protest on her own outside of Swedish Parliament House. And from there, she sparked this international environmental movement. So in 2018, there was tens of thousands of people who came out to protest. And from there, it spiraled into over 8 million students in 2019. So you can see that it generated a lot of popularity amongst school students. So there hasn't, as I said, there hasn't been much published on this topic, but especially from the critical discourse analysis perspective. So a couple of studies in Europe and America had looked at this through the Swedish and German press, and they found that they were delegitimized by the use of ageist language, and that's something I also have found in my study as well. So firstly, I need to understand why so many people would be going out and protesting for. Well, there's a scientific consensus that climate change is a very serious issue that humanity faces, and arguably could be one of the most important issues that humanity needs to address. So climate change is caused from CO2 emissions from our fossil fuel usage, and from that it's causing a rise in average temperature, and then it leads to these extreme weather conditions such as floods and bushfires and droughts. And we're facing a climate emergency according to the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, and we have 12 years left to avert this climate change catastrophe. So there's lots of psychological research that has indicated that there's a significant positive correlation between levels of distress and concern about climate change. And in lots of survey data, they've shown that even up to 95% of the samples that young children and those below the age of 25 have been experiencing this climate-related distress. And there's this gap in the literature I found on the definition of what eco-anxiety is. In this study, I defined it as worry, heightened concern, which may encompass various types and degrees of distress, physical and/or psychological, about the present environment climate crisis and the future state of the planet, namely the health and of human and non-human life and ecosystems. So as I said, I used a critical discourse analysis to look at rhetorical repertoires, strategies on modes of argumentative presentation, to look at emerging themes from extracts of the data from the newspaper. So essentially this is a qualitative method. It's linguistic, and it's it looks at how language is socially constructed and how it's used to describe and explain language in its socio-political context. And so what I did was you went through Newsbank articles and then did a secondary search looking through 8 different popular publications, and I based that on their circulation rates. So in total, there was 326 articles, and I removed stuff that were irrelevant or repeats. And then I focused on looking at 100 opinion articles and took a subsample of 9 of them to demonstrate the most recurring themes. So from the data, what I found was that the conservative sources were not a huge difference here, but they were still more negatively portrayed the school strikers and diminished the significance of climate change. Whereas the more progressive sources, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, they framed them all positive from my sample that I had taken. So the only thing to note for that, though, is the Australian Financial Review is actually owned by Nine Entertainment Corporation. So that's supposed to be more progressive. However, since it's actually one of the most leading economic and financial paper in Australia, that would favour economic growth and profits. So that would be an explanation as to why it was portrayed more negatively. So I just wanted to quickly show you what an example of an extract looks like. So you have the different lines numbered, and just to focus on what your argument is trying to portray. So not to bombard you with extracts, I just we should just put these main themes into just a diagram here. So what I have found from the data was that there was the 2 main themes of delegitimization and legitimization of the school strikers and the climate crisis. So the previous studies that I mentioned before, they had yielded similar findings to use these rhetorical strategies to discredit the school strikers. You know, referred to them as disobedient, and that they were manipulated by all these external sources such as the school curriculum or the political left from universities and the curriculum and other various forces. Whereas the progressive sources were legitimised Greta Thunberg and the school strikers and recognised the ecological crisis, and they would refer to them as mature and ecologically informed generation. The other interesting thing I found from my study was there wasn't that much reference to eco-anxiety. With an example from a conservative source, they undermined them by saying they were driven by climate panic, whereas some from the progressive sources mentioned explicitly about eco-anxiety. So that was a interesting finding from this. So what that shows in conclusion is that my hypothesis was supported, and that it was interesting that there wasn't much discussion on eco-anxiety as I originally thought. And another reason I chose the opinion pieces was because the factual reporting of hard news was framed more neutrally, and it supports the previous findings from the other literature that they used ageist language to describe the school strikers. And this has filled in a gap in existing knowledge, as I said, that there's been no discursive research on this. And future research will probably keep exploring eco-anxiety as the climate crisis will keep worsening. And so this will be probably more of a prevalent issue, and also how the media report on this. And here are all my references for my images and the sources. So any questions today? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Brittany. That was very relevant, I think. So again, I'll be reading the chat if the judges have any questions.
Hi, Brittany. Very nice presentation. I was just wondering, like, if you do have plans to continue this research and trying to design questionnaires to be given to the students for them by themselves
Yeah,
to see if they really affected.
yeah, that's exactly right. Because there's so many things you could be doing with this sort of field of research. I was thinking of doing my PhD and perhaps, yeah, doing some questionnaires to see more of extent of how many people are experiencing this eco-anxiety and I suppose their opinions and attitudes towards climate change.
Yeah, because I think your research clearly shows that it's economic driven, like the opinions, then which is very difficult to see, like what could be pressuring the people that's affected by this. If one journal has just an opinion because there is economic issues that is going to be affected if we change the way that the industries are today, then it's very interesting to go.
Yes, because News Corp already has this established bias because they're pro-economic growth, and whereas progressive sources are more sympathetic towards the climate crisis and realise our limits to growth. So that's what this research had confirmed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just have a quick question, and again, very well done. I thought it was very interesting, and you positioned your research really well in terms of both something that's relevant, but also the broader topics that you were discussing. In terms of your findings, one thing you definitely made it clear that there was a sort of ageist approach to criticising the students. And so you could in some way say there was I wouldn't mind going back to your screen, but anyway, there was sort of ageist on one side, and then the other kind of more positive views weren't ageist. But I wonder if there were sort of other parameters that you could see in terms of the negatives and positives, the people in favour and the people against, aside from that. So were there any other kinds of generalisations you could make, especially thinking about discourse analysis and about the kind of language that was used? Or was that would you say, the most important thing? Yeah,
they were the most important things that I have found. With the conservative sources, their main arguments were about, but this recurring theme I found was about the economic ramifications of, reducing our fossil fuel consumption, and that these nefarious forces had been acting to influence the climate protesters. And they would bring in one article that I had looked at. They would bring in an expert to somehow some people want to say that the science isn't settled. So that's just another way that they had tried to discredit the movement and climate change.
So would you say that this sort of the positive and negative was kind of not at all reciprocal, if you like? So it wasn't a case of ageist versus non-ageist. There were other kind of things that were sort of equally balanced in whether the newspapers supported or didn't support them. They were kind of picking on different things, if you like, except for the point about economic.
I suppose so, yeah. A few articles would do it from a perspective of some parents who are out in the rural area. And so they had their concerns about how there would be a very high unemployment rate if there was to not be using in the fossil fuel industry. Or Andrew Bolt was one of the key authors for this conservative outlet, and he just went on a vicious attack of Greta and that's just the main thing I have found.
Well done, really interesting work. Thank you
very much, I appreciate it.
I think that's all we have time for. Unfortunately, we've gotten some great insights into the power of language and discourse in this session. So that brings us to the end. Big thanks to our judges, and of course congratulations to our student presenters. Of course the recording will be made available online following the conferences, and I hope we'll see you in other sessions.